few weeks ago, I uploaded this Wisp video, and saying it was received with mixed reviews, well, that would be a bit of an understatement. Many of you really did not like it. So today, I have for you an improved Wisp 2.0. Big shoutouts to all generous channel members who helped me keep the lights on, and now, let's jump right into it. Now, first of all, because some of you were asking, why did I even take down the old Wisp guide and why am I now remaking it? See, when it comes to my build guides, not everybody always agrees on my approaches. Warframe, after all, offers a lot of variety and everybody has their own preferences. So if something I put out simply doesn't resonate with you, that's completely fine. Sometimes though, it's not just personal taste, but I actively slip up and get something wrong. Usually this is not too impactful, and if I notice it, I just correct it in the pinned comment, but for my Wisp guide, there were simply too many things to ignore so that I had to fully revamp the entire build, and that's what you're gonna see today. For this new approach, I researched information from multiple sources, but overwhelmingly the tips that I used came from a creator by the name of Moke. He's a Wisp main, he has some very detailed stuff about Wisp on his channel, and even though I personally don't agree with every single point that he makes, his channel definitely has a ton of valuable information, link in the description, and with all that being said, let's finally get into Wisp. Let's talk about the skills again. I know I did it already in my last video, but I left out some very important information when discussing the skills, so give me the chance to give you a more in-detail look into what Wisp can do, starting out with her passive, where I'm really unhappy with my choice of words from the last video. Wisp's passive makes her invisible whenever she is in the air. You can see it by this little particle effect around her. While she's in the air, she's completely invisible to all enemies, and also for a brief period after landing, this invisibility will hold on, so you can theoretically bunny hop through the entire mission without anyone ever noticing you. Now, to be precise here, if you fire a weapon, even a silenced one, this will instantly break your invisibility. However, attacking with a melee weapon does not break your invisibility, and that's also something that we're going to use later on. All in all, Wisp's passive is really good. Naturally, it's of course going to come in very handy in day-to-day gameplay. Wisp's first skill is called Reservoirs. This one is very nice. What Wisp can do is summon 3 different reservoirs, each one giving you a different buff. You have one that increases your maximum health and also gives you a ton of health regeneration per second. You have another one that increases your movement speed as well as your fire rate and melee attack speed. That is going to come in very handy too. And thirdly, you have a shock reservoir, which gives you a buff that shoots out lightnings to nearby enemies, inflicting them with electricity status and stunning them for a moment. When you put down these reservoirs, all you have to do to get the buffs, and this also counts for your teammates of course, is to walk through their little circle of influence on the floor, and then these buffs will stay with you even if you leave the circle. Now, about these 3 buffs, in my last video I said you should pretty much have them on all the time, but there is a bit of nuance to it. While yes, it is true, the health and the movement speed buff, you want to have them on you at any given point, they're just objectively awesome. For the shock one, it's a bit more nuanced. See, when you stun enemies with it, that means they will stay in position for a little while until the shock runs out. And while this can definitely be good for crowd control, the problem is that for some mission types, you actively want the enemies to come to you as fast as possible, for example in defense missions. And especially in those scenarios, I agree that it's not going to be great if you run around with that because you're going to artificially delay the mission. Also, if you were to try to stay invisible for the entire duration of the mission, this too would bite you in the admittedly well-shaped butt, because when you're invisible and enemies are not alerted, you can get a fat melee damage bonus, and if you were to go for that type of playstyle, then shocking the enemies and making them aware of your presence in that regard would pretty much be the last thing you want to do. So, long story short, for the health and the movement reservoir, always have those buffs on. As for the shock one, it comes down to what type of mission you're running. Now, Reservoirs also has an augment which replaces the 3 individual reservoirs with one big one that gives you all 3 at the same time. This one, in my opinion, is super convenient for those players who want to go for all 3 buffs, but on the other side, if you were to be in a situation where you don't want to have the shock buff, of course you don't go for the augment. I personally don't find it to be that much of an inconvenience to have to place down 3 individual ones, because in reality you do it once here and there and then you stop thinking about it. But if you value convenience over anything else, then this one might be worth a consideration. Skill number 2, Will-O-Wisp. This one is one of the literal strongest survival abilities in the entirety of Warframe. When you use Will-O-Wisp, Wisp is shooting out a clone of herself that moves in the direction that you were aiming when you casted the skill. This clone will draw all enemies' attention instantly to it so that they completely forget about you, and what's more is that while the clone is out, Wisp herself becomes completely invisible, also just like with the passive, marked by little particles around her. So, in other words, free invisibility. But this is not even where it ends, because when you tap the ability button again while the clone is out, then you teleport to the position of the clone and this is more important, become completely invincible for 3 seconds by your health bar turning gray. This is kind of like rolling guard. And with that being said, you might notice why this skill is so incredibly busted. All you gotta do to pretty much avoid damage entirely is to shoot out the clone, and then you're invisible and all the enemies will be distracted. And you can do whatever you like. Even if you fire a weapon, this invisibility will never break. And then in the unlikely case that you actually do take damage or you get a fet slash or heat proc, you can just quickly double tap the second ability and therefore gain complete invincibility. This way, there's hardly any situation where enemies can even attack Wisp in the first place. Skill number 3 is the big damage dealer for Wisp, and it goes by the name of Breach Surge. Now, when you cast Breach Surge, then you're going to shoot out so-called Surge Sparks. The first thing that happens is that these Surge Sparks, when they hit an enemy, the enemy is being blinded. Just that this one here also works on Eximus units and those that have Overguard. When you deal damage to an enemy affected by a Surge Spark, there is a 10% chance that this enemy will shoot out another Surge Spark that, if it hits an enemy, deals 2 times the damage that triggered it. And then when an enemy dies, there's not only a chance to trigger one of these sparks, but there will be a guaranteed one. So far, so good. Surge Sparks blinding enemies, alright, spreading more damage, that is also cool, but there are some other mechanics that you need to know about it. Firstly, the hits of the Surge Sparks are actually critical hits. This crit is always yellow and it has a 1.5 times crit damage multiplier. Next, if you cast Breach Surge while your clone from your second ability is out, then not only will these Surge Sparks be shot out from your position, but also from the current position of the clone. This way you can spread the effect even easier, and what's more is, when you aim at one of your Reservoirs from your first ability and then trigger Breach Surge, what happens is you will teleport to the position of that reservoir, the range here is infinite, and then Breach Surge is going to be triggered from the position of the reservoir with double the range that it would usually have. If you have a clone out and do the teleportation, then you're going to get twice the range on both you and the clone. So there is some crazy synergy going on that I didn't mention last time, but after some reflection, I think it's definitely worth mentioning. Now, Breach Surge also has an augment that gives you more crit chance if you do this teleportation to the reservoir. The crit chance is depending on how far you teleported, and just like I said last time, it's definitely worth a try. I personally value consistency, so I find it kind of fiddly to have to do that in the heat of battle every time, but that doesn't mean it's a bad augment. Try it for yourself, see if you like it, and then make the decision if you want to use it or not. And finally, we have Wisp's fourth ability, Soulgate. This one shoots out a laser beam directly from the sun, and while this sounds impressive, the damage is not all too amazing. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely good enough to deal with base steel path enemies if you build for it, but most people say, and I fully agree, that if you use a helmet ability in this slot, then it's overall gonna be a better choice if you want to deal the most damage possible. And just by the way, if you could maybe drop a quick like for the video, that would be a big help with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. Now, before we jump into the build itself, I quickly want to talk about the topic of survivability, because for Wisp, there are sort of 2 schools of thought here, and if you ask me, both are perfectly viable. See, first of all, Wisp is a really good health tank. This is mostly because of the buff from her first ability that increases your maximum health and gives you ungodly amounts of health regeneration as long as you have a high ability strength. And then naturally also for a tanking build, you would have to dedicate Archon shards, arcanes or mods, whatever floats your boat, to the standard stuff like more armor, damage resistance through adaptation, and all that good stuff. I personally don't want to give a dedicated health tanking build today because, in all honesty, with Wisp it comes down to personal preference as to how much you want to invest into survivability. At the end of the day, I can't tell you how much tankiness you should have. That is your personal decision. Now, the reason why I'm saying this and why I'm being so vague about the tanking playstyle is that there is a different sort of school of thought when it comes to making Wisp survivable, and that is not really going into health tanking, but into avoiding damage altogether. Let me explain what I mean here. As you might remember from her ability section, she has a healthy amount of skills that allow her to kind of not get targeted in the first place. We have her passive that makes her invisible while she's in the air. We have her second ability that A, makes her invisible while her clone is out, and B, allows her to get complete invincibility for 3 seconds. And as if all that is not already enough, then she also has Breach Surge, which blinds nearby enemies, including Eximus units, so that they couldn't attack you even if you were not invisible. In other words, when you play Wisp, it's probably going to be very rare that you take damage in the first place, and even if you do, you could quickly double tap your second ability to get those 3 seconds of invincibility to get you out of a tight spot. If you ask me, both of these approaches are equally viable. If you feel safe and comfortable just eating up all the damage with tons of armor and damage reduction, then health tanking is going to be the way to go for you. But on the other hand, Wisp also makes it really easy to keep all the enemies distracted from you in a way that you don't really have to worry about your health and your tankiness at all. But alright, with all that being said, let's finally take a look at my new Wisp build 2.0, starting out with a quick explanation on what I'm actually going for here and how that build is meant to work. Just like last time, this Wisp build is focused on dealing a lot of damage in the entire room by using Breach Surge and making those Surge Sparks deal a crazy load of damage. In order to stay alive, I chose the second way of survivability that I just talked about, that being avoiding getting hit in the first place, but don't worry, in case you want to play her as a more health tanky type of Warframe, I will also explain a couple details on how you might be able to mix up the build if that is what you go for. And finally, I tested this build in solo survival, meaning I used all 3 buffs from her first ability, but here too, the build wouldn't really change if you want to leave that out, so you can easily use this in other mission types as well without having to switch anything out. The way this is meant to be played is actually pretty simple. At the beginning of the mission, I put down my 3 buffs, then I bounce around the level a little bit, profiting from her passive and the invisibility that it brings to me, and then when I enter combat, there are 2 things that I do. First of all, I trigger my clone from the second ability, so I become invisible and the enemies are distracted. This way, I'm sort of protected. And then as well, I trigger Breach Surge to blind the enemies and also be able to spread the damage even further with the Surge Sparks. That's what we're modding for today, and in my testing, this has worked phenomenally well. I was dealing tons of damage, so now let's take a look at how I made it happen. First off, let's take a look at the Archon charts. For Wisp, there are multiple options. In general, you want to make sure that your Wisp has as much ability strength as possible, because more ability strength means the buffs from your first ability are all going to be stronger. That's nice. And then 2, the damage from the Surge Sparks also scales with ability strength, so naturally, more strength means more damage, and that is why you could totally go and slot in 5 Tau Forged Red Shards if you wanted to really max out your damage potential. If you wanted to tank more, you could use blue shards for more armor as well. And what I'm going for here is a sort of hybrid approach where I go for, yes, more ability strength, as I initially said, but then I also use 2 violet Archon shards, both increasing my melee crit damage, because I personally just love using Wisp with melee weapons. But if you personally don't want to go for melee, that's fine. You just swap out these 2 violet ones for whatever floats your boat. Now, let's take a look at the build itself, where the first thing I want to talk about is the combination of 1 Arcane plus the Aura mod. That 1 Arcane that I was talking about would be Arcane Avenger. I personally love using Arcane Avenger. It's almost universally a great decision on pretty much anything, and what it does is it gives you a flat 45% additional crit chance if you take damage. Just like with my last build, I again decided to combine this Arcane with the Aura mod Combat Discipline, and before you get mad at me, let me explain for a second as to why I made this decision. Combat Discipline, in case you didn't know it, is a mod that takes away some of your health whenever you annihilate an enemy. One of the reasons why I chose this is because Arcane Avenger, in order to get the crit buff, requires you to take damage, and Combat Discipline does that for you. Now, you're probably going to say, Arcane Avenger does not only work on your health being damaged, but also on your shield being damaged. You do not need Combat Discipline to make that happen. And yes, this is completely true. The reason why I chose to do this anyway is because of Wisp's survivability. As we already established, Wisp is A, invisible whenever she's in the air, so she's not going to take damage. B, she is invisible whenever her clone is out, so she's not going to take damage. and C, even if the enemies were completely aware of where she is, then we still have our Breach Surge that blinds nearby enemies, making it impossible for them to attack us, so again, we don't take damage. Of course, all of this is not 100% waterproof, and you will take occasional damage here and there from some AoE or whatever, but in my personal opinion, this is not consistent enough to constantly have Arcane Avenger up, and that's why I decided to still use Combat Discipline, because this one gives me the reliability that I want. Okay, now with Combat Discipline and Arcane Avenger explained, the next mod that I use is Archon Intensify. Archon Intensify gives us 30% ability strength, but it has an additional effect that gives us another 30% ability strength if we're restoring health with an ability. So because we're going to have the healing buff from our first ability constantly up, and Combat Discipline takes a bit from our health away every time we take out an enemy, that means we're constantly being healed. That means Archon Intensify is constantly triggered, so we're actually not getting 30, but constant 60% more ability strength from this mod. Now, to be fair here, this is not a definite truth or anything. You can disagree with this approach, and that is perfectly fine. In fact, I even have a little alternative in case you don't want to go for Combat Discipline, that being replacing Combat Discipline with Growing Power, which gives you more ability strength, and replacing Archon Intensify with Umbral Intensify. And it's totally okay if you prefer this variant, especially if you don't want to go for Arcane Avenger, because then there's really no need for Combat Discipline at all. Next, I want to talk about the Aura mod, and this one might be a little bit controversial, but I'm gonna die on that hill if I have to. I went for Prime Sure-Footed, and I think this is actually really important for Wisp if you want to be survivable long term. Here's why. As I already explained, this Wisp build is not meant to take a lot of damage, it's meant to avoid it entirely by not being hit in the first place. And while that's all nice and well, especially in higher levels, if you were to get knocked down, this ends up being really dangerous because when you're lying on the floor, then you can't do anything for a moment, and that gives the enemy an opportunity to take you out. Now, I'm perfectly aware that Prime Sure-Footed is kind of a meme mod and that it is a login bonus, so not everybody will have it. In case you want to go for this build and you don't have Prime Sure-Footed, then there are two alternative options that I have for you, and that would be either the mod Handspring, which allows you to get on your feet faster, or you just use normal Sure-Footed with 60% knockdown resistance, and then sacrifice another mod slot on your main build for Fortitude, which gives you another 40%, so with these mods together, you would also have 100% knockdown resistance. Whew, that was quite a lot of explaining, but don't worry, this was the more complicated part. The rest of the build is relatively straightforward, because now we double down into ability strength, with Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude, and Mold Augmented. Then I also went for ability duration, because having the buffs up for longer is super convenient, and then of course, because I used the clone from her second ability a lot to stay invisible, I wanted to make sure that that clone is on the field as long as possible, so I don't have to constantly re-trigger it. That's why I went for Primed Continuity as well as Narrow-Minded. Up next, because Narrow-Minded reduces your ability range a lot, we go for Archon Stretch, which increases that range again, and it has the additional effect that we regain energy when we deal electricity damage to enemies with abilities, and because of the shock buff from our first, we have this little regeneration on all the time. Primed Flow for more maximum energy, and because I felt that my energy income from just Archon Stretch wasn't quite enough for my liking, I used Energy Nexus in addition so that we have a total of 5 energy regenerated per second. That was comfortable, but if you wanted to, you could also always use Equilibrium instead. This right here would then be the full build, and now let's also quickly take a look at which helmet ability we're gonna want to use. In my old guide, I used Roar to increase the damage from our Surge Sparks, but I learned that when you go for Eclipse instead, with Wisp using a thrown melee weapon, which, spoilers, we are gonna do, that is gonna yield better results than Roar, so that's what we're gonna use today. But if you wanted to, there are also viable other options. For example, Grindel's Nourish, which not only helps with the energy regeneration, but also it gives you AoE viral priming whenever you take damage. You could use a grouping ability, because grouping enemies up is always a good decision when going for Breach Surge. And if your monkey brain really likes big red number, then one thing you could also do is go for Wrathful Advance from Kullervo. And there are also some crazy Xata's Whisper interactions, especially when you want to go for guns instead of thrown melee, but I don't want to go into that all too deep right now. Which subzoom do you prefer? Let me know in the comments down below. Now, that was definitely quite a bit on how to play Wisp, but I hope that in comparison to my last video, I explained myself better and showed you why I made the choices that I made, as well as showing some viable alternatives. However, building Wisp herself is only half of the job, and the other half would be choosing the right weapons to go along with her, so let's talk about that right now. First and foremost, Wisp and her Surge Sparks are always great. No matter which weapon you choose, as long as you deal a lot of damage to the enemies, the Surge Sparks are going to deal a lot of damage to other enemies. However, if you want to have the biggest possible numbers, then I would recommend going for heavy hitter weapons, those that have a slower fire rate but therefore deal massive damage when they hit the enemy. One example here, and also a favorite weapon of mine, would be the Kuva Shakur, which is not only a crit beast, but also deals significant damage if you manage to score a headshot. But you could also go for AoE heavy hitters, like for example the Latron and Karnon, or, and yes, I am going to say it, the Stalta. However, while primary weapons are definitely very nice and totally viable, I today again opted for a thrown melee. This time though, it's not the Glaive Prime, but today we're going to use the Zoris, which performs much better when paired with Wisp. So let's take a look at how I built it. This right here would be my Zoris build, and it is a pretty straightforward thrown melee type build that focuses on the explosion of the projectile. One thing I do want to mention here though is that it is built for pure direct damage, trying to deal as much as possible, because as we remember, the more damage we deal to the enemy, the more damage the Surge Sparks will deal to the other enemies. And finally, to deal as much damage as possible with our throws, I used a melee arcane called Melee Crescendo. Let me explain why. When you perform a heavy attack with your melee weapon, then the combo counter that you have at that point will work as a damage multiplier, meaning the higher the combo counter, the more damage the heavy attack will deal, and with a combo counter that can go up to 12 times, that can lead to some significant damage increases. Problem though is, after a heavy attack, your combo counter goes back down to 0 and you have to build it up again. And that is exactly where Melee Crescendo comes in. Melee Crescendo makes it that whenever you perform a finisher on an enemy, you gain a bit of initial combo counter. What that means is that even if your combo counter goes down after a heavy attack, it won't go down to 0, it will only go down to whatever Melee Crescendo is currently at. In other words, if you manage to take out enough enemies with finishers, then it would theoretically be possible to even constantly maintain a 12 times combo multiplier even if you're heavy attacking. Now, to be fair here, even if you have Melee Crescendo, in reality the combo counter takes a little bit to tick up again after a heavy attack, so really opting for 12x would be a bit of an overkill. If you ask me, in day-to-day gameplay, it's enough to stack Melee Crescendo up to a constant 6x multiplier, and then you should be good. Now, the question remains though, how are we going to get enough finishers in order to stack it that high? Now, in my last video, what I did was using the Bronco as a secondary weapon with its special mod Dizzying Rounds that opens up enemies to finishers, but an easier and quicker method here would be going for the Vazarin Focus Tool on your operator and using your second ability from it. What this does is suck in enemies, and that too opens them up to ground finishers with your Warframe, which also count towards Melee Crescendo. As you also see in the background, this goes very quick and easy. For your secondary weapon, you're free to use whatever you like. If you want to go for a Zoris just like me, I would recommend a weapon that's good with priming. I personally went for the Epitaph as a primer, but you could of course also use stuff like the Kuva Nukor or the Compressor, or what is a very nice approach, especially if you want to go for health tanking, is not using a traditional primer weapon, but the Grimoire. As I also explained in other videos, the Grimoire has a mod that allows you to temporarily increase your ability strength. Why would you want to do that? Because the Reservoirs from your one snapshot the ability strength that you had at the moment that you put them down. In other words, if you temporarily increase your ability strength and then summon your 3 buffs, that means even if this ability strength buff runs out a couple seconds later, the buffs still gonna remain at the strength that they had with the higher ability strength, giving you even more maximum health and even more health regeneration. Just by the way, there are also multiple other ways to further increase your ability strength. Moog has talked more about that in his Wisp guide. But I myself, and I know also most of you, prefer a more casual playstyle with more convenient to play builds that don't involve thousands of things that you have to swap around between, so I'm gonna keep it at that for this video today. Okay, now before we wrap the video up for today, let's also quickly talk about companion options where I have 2 nice choices prepared for you. On the one hand, you could of course go for the Panzerwalperpfeiler. This right here would be my personal Panzerwalperpfeiler build, but you don't have to completely copy it. What you really only need would be Synth Deconstruct to have more health orbs, works very nice with Equilibrium, but mainly Viral Quills and Panzer Devolution, because that is what allows the Panzerwalperpfeiler to viral prime all the enemies around you, which means they take much more damage. This would especially be a good choice if you don't want to go for a thrown melee weapon with a primer in the other hand, but rather for a primary weapon and you don't want to swap around between your primer and your actual main weapon all the time. Then the Panzerwölbefeiler is nice by inflicting all that viral for you in a passive way. What I personally went for today though would be the brand new Nautilus Prime, because as I already said, when you want to deal the most carnage possible with your Surge Sparks, then it is definitely advantageous if enemies are neatly grouped up together, and Nautilus Prime with his skill Cordon can do that for you. This right here would be my personal Nautilus Prime build. Not everything here is 100% needed, but one thing you definitely should have would be Tenacious Bond, because what this does is, if your companion has 50% or more crit chance, then you get a final plus 1.2x crit damage multiplier. Now, in pretty much all my videos beforehand, I have fundamentally misunderstood how this mod actually works, and that is kind of a bit embarrassing, I have to admit, but let me make this clear now once and for all. What this plus 1.2x final crit damage multiplier means is, if your crit damage multiplier is, let's say, 2x, then with Tenacious Bond, this would be increased to 3.2x. That's how it works. And the reason why this is so incredibly OP for Wisp is that, remember, her Surge Sparks are actual critical hits, and they do have a 1.5 times critical damage multiplier. With Tenacious Bond, this 1.5 times is increased to 2.7, aka this almost doubles the crit damage of the Surge Sparks, therefore being incredibly busted on Wisp. Now, of course, this only works if your companion has 50 or more % crit chance, and the way you do this is, for the Panzerwölbefeiler, you go with the mod Bite, that increases your crit chance enough, and for Sentinels, like the Nautilus Prime here, you would go either for the Volclock or the Volcax weapon. Those have enough base crit chance that you can get it to over 50%, and in the very lucky case that you have a Riven for the Verglass, you can use the Verglass Prime with a Riven that gives you crit chance to get to over 50%. If you have that, that's amazing, definitely go for the Verglass Prime then. If not, Volcax or Volclock are both totally okay as well. And speaking of Nautilus Prime, this little fella is actually super crazy strong and can easily do all the combat for you. If you want to know more about that, then definitely also check out this video next. Another big shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Lycan Shepherd, Turtlepeer, Pepperwolf, Ondakani02, Misfire DX, Streamjet21, Synapking 5000, Ripley Pixie, Mihawk HE, Yagis, Hoke Hunter, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.